So today in this video, I'm going to talk about something that generally comes very difficult in high conflict situations. If you're new here, my name is Scott Carter. I'm a licensed therapist. I specialize in several things. One of them has turned out to be high conflict custody, divorce, co-parenting, and the like. In terms of high conflict types, those who have personality disorders. If you have an ex who just causes a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulty, a lot of problems, I'm kind of your guy. And so today I want to talk about something that is usually overlooked when it comes to high conflict situations. And really, the truth is, like when people come to me for help in these areas, the truth of the matter is that they are dealing with a lot of different dynamics. This is not just a cut and dry situation. People hire me as a therapist for a lot of issues. Sometimes they're depressed and anxious, and we can work on that, and that's what we focus on. Sometimes they, maybe they have something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and that's what we work on. I get a lot of parents that come together with their teenager, and that's what we work on. But when it comes to the high conflict situations, it's way more complicated. There's so many different parts of the equation. And what I have to usually emphasize to people when they hire me for this type of stuff is that all of the dynamics and all the components, they interact with each other. They are enmeshed with each other. There's a lot of interaction. And it's what you have to understand is if you make an adjustment in one area, something else is going to be affected. It's like a seesaw. Something can't go up without something else going down. And so there are so many complex dynamics in these situations. And again, so many people come to me because they just have a hard time navigating all of this, and rightly so. This is some of the most complex and difficult work that I do. But generally speaking, I know, and I don't blame people, they want relief, they want help, and they want it improved, and they want it fast because their anxiety is super high. And it's a long process. You have to understand that fixing these problems, fixing these situations, it's a long process. And I believe it's important to address all of the parts of the equation, okay? And I've got a nifty little infographic that I'm going to share, and because there's a part of this whole equation that is probably the most important, but is probably the most overlooked or passed on or ignored when I feel like it is actually the most important one, and I'll explain why. But let's get to it. I'll show you how this works, okay? So generally speaking, these are probably the four most important components of a high conflict situation, okay? Let's start at the top left. We got co-parenting, right? You're interacting with the high conflict ex. You're trying to decrease conflict. You're trying to keep things working, trying to manage that whole thing, trying to mitigate the chaos. On the top right over here we go. We've got court. Sometimes they're either dealing with court, they're in court, and I've seen these custody battles go on for, the longest I've ever heard was over a decade straight. But it's not uncommon for a court case to go on for 4 years, 5 years or more. And obviously in this regard, I mean, when you're trying to deal with attorneys and judges in court, that by itself is extremely challenging, is extremely messy. Attorneys and judges, I have very, very poor opinion of attorneys and judges for family court. I have a very, very poor experience base when it comes to attorneys and judges, and what they claim to do for families and what they don't do for families, and instead they often do more harm than good. Okay, down here we got kids, trying to parent, making choices like what's good for the kids. You know, what do I say to them? What do I not say to them? One thing that just came to mind up here under the co-parenting part is there's usually a lot of gaslighting that's involved. And so I would put that bullet point there. If I was going to edit this, I would put gaslighting. It's just part of the whole dynamic, okay? But people are very accustomed to, what do I say to the kids? What do I don't say to the kids? Um, if the high conflict parent is really hard on the kids, am I a bad parent by attempting to restrict them? And the fear kicks in too, right? If they try to intervene for the kids, then they're going to end up on the receiving end as well. If we go back up to the court, I'm just trying to demonstrate and illustrate here how all of this sort of interacts, right? That, like, if they're gaslighting you, it affects the kids. And if you intervene, if you say, hey, that's not okay, that's not good enough, they usually fly over to court. Like, I'm going to take you to court. I hear this all the time. If you're not in court, there's usually the threat of going to court. Okay, and that's neither here nor there. That's a different video altogether. But you can kind of see this whole dynamic going. So I'm honestly going to end up doing a series of videos on all of this dynamic and how the different factors work and how it all weighs and a lot of my decision-making processes when I'm working with clients in this regard. Okay, but we're going to talk today mostly about self-care. And this is probably the most important and yet overlooked aspect of this whole equation, okay? You can't see this down here. It says managing anxiety. But if you've ever been in a relationship, a close relationship, long-term relationship with someone who, for example, has narcissistic personality disorder, quite frankly, there's trauma there. And the way that we know this is because you will get an overactive limbic system. Your limbic system is kind of this part in your brain, has several different components to it. And this is where your fight or flight rests. This is where your emotions, memories, anxiety, panic, fear, and when it's overactive, you're going to experience a lot of fear, a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety. And quite frankly, if you're in this whole messy situation, this is usually the stuff down here that comes last. This is the stuff that to me, in my experience and in my professional opinion, has the greatest impact for better outcomes or better results in the whole dynamic. And yet it gets overlooked the most. And you should not overlook this. First, I want to kind of address why people ignore self-care. Now, first of all, they're dealing with all these other dynamics. And so it just tends to topple down the priority list, okay? And they also believe, they get it baked into them, the self-care is being selfish. And that often goes back to the traumatic relationship. Can't even have a component that's rooted in when they were a child, that if they had a narcissistic parent or maybe a borderline parent that really, really discouraged them from being selfish. And anytime they engaged in doing something for themselves that was just for the better good for themselves, it was labeled as selfish. It was given an ugly, nasty label, and then a certain behavior, self-care behaviors, might get attached to trauma. Also, I have found that the caretaking parent is usually the low conflict parent. And they are the ones who are always trying to decrease conflict. They're always afraid. They're usually anxious. They're avoiding anger. And if you ask me, avoiding an angry, high conflict ex is a bad goal. That's usually the top priority. Probably a different video altogether. But that usually takes precedence over virtually everything else, is to decrease the conflict. I just believe that's a bad priority. But when you have an overactive fear response and an overactive limbic system, that's just what results, okay? And so the reason why people need to need to invest a lot into self-care is because it will help resolve the trauma. It will help them overcome the trauma. Because what happens, right, if you start thinking, you know what, I could really use a day off. I'm going to go for a jog. Maybe I'll do yoga. I'm going to cook myself a good meal. I'm going to go do something fun. I'm going to do a little bit of shopping, and I'm going to neglect all my other responsibilities. I'm going to neglect work for the day. I'm going to not clean the house, make the meals, drive the kids around, whatever. a lot of guilt and shame kicks in. And that can often be tied to the relationship, the traumatic relationship or the trauma that happened within the relationship, and the limbic system activates big time because it's trying to protect you, because it has learned that if you engage in certain behaviors, you're going to take heat from that person, even if they're gone, right? So what you want to do is definitely engage in self-care. You must learn to quiet the fear. You must learn to manage the anxiety. This is your biggest and most difficult battle. If you can learn to really, really do this part, the rest of it becomes exponentially easier. The rest of it will sway into another side. And I just got this question yesterday. And that was, well, if I set boundaries with the high conflict type, this is just an example. If I set boundaries, right? If I go to the co-parenting part and make changes there, won't have a negative effect on the kids. Truth of the matter is, doing nothing has a more detrimental effect on the kids. Okay, the reason why I push these people to engage in self-care is because this is what we want the kids to do. If your anxiety is managed, if you are no longer afraid of the anger, if you are not controlled by the fear of the situation, your kids are more likely to be not controlled by the fear. You want your kids to not be afraid of that person, or your high conflict ex, and they're definitely going to be afraid of that parent if you are. They can see it, and kids are more intuitive than we are because they're less cerebral, they're less cognitive, so they have to rely on their emotional brain because that's what functions. And so intuitively, if they see you living in fear, that's where they will also live. Okay. So self-care, make that your priority. And I know people are like, well, what about? I promise all of these other things will become less burdensome and less tedious and less demanding if you manage your trauma and your anxiety, okay? If you need some help with that, you may want to find a therapist for yourself and learn to manage anxiety and learn to manage the trauma, okay? So once again, make sure you like and subscribe to all of this. I'm going to do multiple videos on this whole thing and talk about all the different dynamics here. I will put a link in the description below for both my 5 mandatory rules for high conflict divorce and custody, my rules for high conflict co-parenting, and I am on a limited basis because I am very busy, available for personal hire, for personal consultation. I cannot do therapy with you. I cannot help you with the trauma or the anxiety part. I have ended up being a very good consultant, especially in this area, how to deal with in these areas, co-parenting and court. So thank you for watching. Once again, make sure you like and subscribe, and good luck. See you soon.